Once again, I am Taran Daestingr, the not quite Laurel, and I will be teaching part 2 of my crash course in patterning Cotehardie's class. So first thing I want to do on this, which I realize I should have been a little bit better prepared to bring this down so I could show it off. I am a pattern nerd. I am a fit nerd. I love this stuff. I find it super incredibly useful, and it is a difficult thing to learn. I have searched the entire Pacific Northwest for classes in this that don't require getting another degree, and they're really hard to find. So I do my best to try and share my knowledge as much as I can with other people, but I realize there's only so much you can absorb in a couple-hour class. That said, a lot of the stuff that I'm about to go over in this class is something that you can buy yourself a handy reference book that helps you figure these things out without me. So in my Google Drive, which you all should have access to, it should be linked in the class invite, there is a document that is called book review something, where I have basically posted a picture of and description of and why it's cool of every book that is SCA costume related that I have in my possession. I think actually I've added a couple and need to update the document. But the point is, there's a book called Fitting and Pattern Alteration, which unfortunately is only focused on women's clothes. It doesn't really have much in the way of men's garments, but it is an incredibly useful book that divides every section of the body up. So it'll have like a chapter on shoulders, and it'll be like, if your shoulders are broad, here's how you alter a pattern. If your shoulders are narrow, here's how you alter a pattern. If your shoulders are square, here's how you alter the pattern. If your shoulders are sloped, here's how you alter the pattern. And then it will move on to all of the other various aspects of the body, top and bottom, and give you 3 different ways to alter patterns for this particular fit issue, as well as an illustration of what this commonly looks like in garments you're wearing if you have that particular, I don't want to say abnormality, but variance from average, because that's really what it is. It's sizing is the average of all of our varied bodies. And speaking from experience, I know that I learned to be a pattern maker because I am not average. My shoulders and rib cage are 3 sizes apart. My shoulders are a 3X. My chest is a large, my rib cage is a medium, and my hips are an extra large. Nothing fits me. But there are things you can learn to do to accommodate for this, even if you aren't drafting your own patterns. You're just altering patterns that you've already found, or altering patterns that you've followed someone's instructions on. So I highly recommend the book Fitting and Pattern Alteration, which you can find in my book review. I bought an older edition. It does not seem to have any typos I've noticed yet, but it's a fantastic resource if you want to learn more about this. Highly recommend. Unfortunately, I didn't bring my copy downstairs, so I can't point it at the camera and tell you how cool it is. I just want to say, if anybody needs a resource on this, the book was like $35 buying a used older edition copy, and it's still fine. So very worth it if you are trying to learn this stuff. Without further ado, I am going to start what the differences are between the men's and women's pattern. So for this, I have basically taken just the standard medium avatars for both men and women and made a Cotehardie pattern that more or less fits them. And what we've come up with for that is the green is the women's pattern and the brown is the men's pattern. So you can see, obviously, our guy is a little bit taller. His arms are longer. His arms are bigger around. There's not actually a whole lot of difference in height between the men's and the women's. Although if you notice, the woman's waist is higher than the men's waist is, because all that extra height of the back is actually going out around the butt. The arm's eye, like I was describing yesterday, you've got the brown arm's eye is almost a J shape. It's fairly flat up here and has a nice, smooth, gentle curve. whereas the green is much more of a C shape. It is curved in, and you can also see that curve in here and a little bit down here. You can see actually the difference in the width of shoulders if you're looking here. You can see that a little bit better because the shoulders are much narrower on the women's garment than on the men's. The actual center front length is not terribly different between the two because, again, we have some bulges to go over that we don't have on the men's. But the high point shoulder is much higher on the men's. So when you're looking at them side by side, it's not quite as apparent how different they are. Again, we've got the women's on the left here and the men's is on the right. So you can see that there's similarities in shaping. They're not terribly different shaped. The biggest change is we've got a much more nipped in waist and this front angles dramatically. Other than that, it's largely a matter of sizing difference. A broad-shouldered lady or someone who lifts stuff could have a similar back and similar sleeves to this. Really, the difference is this shaping to accommodate the bust. So
here, out of curiosity, when we go back to that, is there a great deal of difference in how the men's and women's sleeve is going to end up fitting? It looks like the men's sleeve is significantly straighter, not as molded to the arm and fuller.
Yeah. The goal was to try and get them to be fairly similar. Again, I was doing this right before class. So I only had so much time to get them try exactly fitted at the same level, but the goal is to make them roughly the same. And part of this is just has to do with the proportion of the body. I have up on the screen now, this is the men's that I came up with. There are some things that I would further fine tune, but more or less you can see, here's the pattern, here's what he looks like in the front. His sleeves could have some more taken out. It depends on the fit you're going for. I did not do the looser cuff. I tried to aim for one that would probably need to be buttoned. Here's what the back looks like. And then the women's, well, first of all, for anyone who missed it, I wanted to show how these different patterns fit people differently. So I actually took this pattern exactly as it is and threw it on the female avatar. So also forgive the fact that the avatar is not wearing pants. I'm assuming we're all adults here and can handle that, but I know that our sales team at work gets super weirded out whenever we're showing stuff off and the avatars aren't wearing pants, but did not have time to make them hose. Maybe next time. Here is what Our Lady looks like when she's wearing the men's Cotehardie. She clearly looks like she stole her boyfriend's sweatshirt. Unsurprisingly, really. Her sleeves are they're way too big. They're too long. They're too bulky. The angle of the hip
fluffy arms.
Yeah. The angle of the hip doesn't look too bad. The angle of the shoulders doesn't look too bad. But she clearly is not wearing a fitted garment anymore. So when she's wearing her own clothes, there's the back and there's the front. So here's a little bit of what we were talking about with that front bit that really, this bulge that gets sort of sucked in when you make something snug enough that the fabric can engage. I also did not have time to play with fabric qualities. My 3D rendering software has random unlabeled wool. It doesn't tell me what the weight of it is. So I'm hoping this is a Cotehardie weight. There were only 3 different wools in there. One of them was cashmere, one of them was Melton, and one of them was just wool. So this is just wool. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. I don't understand the fabric qualities well enough. The software I use for this is called Clo, and we're going to get to that when I run out of visual aids. Super awesome software. They do a 30-day free trial if anyone wants to play with it, and there's a lot of video tutorials to teach yourself how to do it. It's fantastic. Seriously, if I ever run out of mundane job and have to go into business for myself, I'm buying a software license because it's awesome. But yes, here's the woman wearing her Cotehardie. Back is over here. So again, I don't have a ton more visual aids before we have to jump into me making stuff up on the fly, which will be fun. But among the things that I do have figured out is a couple of really common fitting problems and how to work with them. Luckily, I have named all of these. This, which hopefully y'all can see, is one of the easiest things to fix in a pattern, and it's really easy to do because trying to judge the angle of your shoulder seams is really, really difficult. The only thing that's wrong with this pattern is that the angle of this shoulder on both the man and the woman, the angle of this shoulder is too steep. So it's resting against the point of the shoulder, but it's sticking up near the neck, and it's causing a little bit of gaping right here, which you can see on both of them in the back. And it's standing up a little way from the body. And if this were a softer fabric, you'd see it also collapsing right here above the collarbone. So that's a super easy fix. The only thing that that's going to need to get better is taking this high point shoulder and just angling that down a little bit. So that's the first thing. One thing that I do want to say before I move on to this, there is a process for fitting, and it's totally okay to go around in circles and start in one place, start and then move to another, and then come back to the first place when you're done. But it is far more efficient to start at the top of the garment and work your way down. So the very first thing I check, assuming you can get the mock-up on, it fits well enough, you can get it on the body. The first thing I will check is this neckline, and I will make sure that this neckline is sitting nicely. So if I were fitting this on someone, the first thing I would do is pin this shoulder seam down so it sits nice and flat across the shoulders like it ought to, and make sure that the shaping of the neck hole looked good and comfortable and was sitting in the right place in the front and on the back. So starting at the top and working your way down is super important because everything hangs from the shoulders. If your shoulders are in the wrong place, weird stuff is gonna happen. So the next visual aid I have is what happens if the other end of the shoulder is up too high. This one's a little harder to spot. The difference that we're seeing here is we're seeing a little bit right here of this sort of M shape in the drag lines. Hers is a little bit more subtle, but she has a little bit more drag line right here. And you can see the same thing in the front too, where she's got just a little bit of folds on the underarm, and he's got these folds right here. And basically what's happened here is, oh, sorry, I'm doing this in the wrong order. The reason you're not seeing any of this in the upper body is because the thing that I messed up on this one is just this underarm. This is what happens if you make your underarm seam a little bit too low, is it sort of sags right down here. So all of these have the underarm of the pattern. So that's this part right here. All of them have that underarm seam sitting about 1/2 inch too low. And the sleeves have been modified to accommodate it. So they all walk together and everything, but you're still getting these saggy drag lines right there, right there, right here. And you can tell if that's the case when you're fitting by basically pinching a little bit of fabric out from the underarm And you want to pinch not so much that the hem stops being even, but just enough that you pick up all of those drag lines. And yes, this would make the arm's eye a little bit smaller. So you would basically be I know it's a half-inch off because I did all of my mess ups a half-inch off on purpose to try and make them big enough that you could see them without making them so big that it is ridiculous. With this, if you just pinch out that half-inch, you're obviously you need to take a half-inch out of the height in the front and a half-inch out of the height in the back. So you're basically taking an entire inch of bicep circumference out of your sleeve. But if you notice, most of the sleeves kind of end up leaning out anyway, because your armhole ends up being bigger than your bicep in most cases. I have met individuals for whom that was not true, but I certainly don't lift enough stuff for that not to be true. But this is also going to help the fit of the sleeve, because you can tell that both of these guys have too much space in their upper sleeve. It's not a big problem to take that out. And honestly, what I would do with that in this pattern is I would only make the modification from about here up. I would only just lean in this little bit to compensate for it. I wouldn't narrow the entire sleeve. So that is problem number 2 of the ones we're going with. One of the other things that happened with this one is the shaping of the arm size just a little bit off as well. You can see how that isn't quite carved in enough down here. It's just sort of stretched straight down. So part of it is also making sure that your shaping fits that natural crease in the body. Here's the one I thought I was going with next, which is, this is the one where I have the entire shoulder seam is off a little bit. I know it's really hard to see these in the avatars. It definitely is easier if you are in person and can move the fabric and see what it's looking like. But you're seeing some of the same drag lines from the other one in both of these bodies. But in this case, we're also seeing a little bit of the shoulder seam creeping to the front, just a little bit. We're seeing that extra underarm bulk. Even though this sleeve is smaller than the one we were just looking at, the bicep looks bigger because that sleeve is hanging down too far. So with this one, the change that needs to happen for that is basically pinching out at the top of this shoulder and moving that whole thing up. So it's still, so the top of the shoulder seam technically can run wherever you want it. There are different style decisions depending on the time and place you are costuming for that put the shoulder seam in different places. I believe from at least what I've been taught, that Cotehardies tend to be straight across the top of the shoulder. Honestly, depending on how much fabric I have and whether or not I need to fudge things, I have moved shoulder seams a little bit one way or another. There's not really any harm in doing so. Also, getting your shoulder seam perfectly aligned is, as I mentioned, one of the harder things to do because that angle is really difficult to guess by measurements, especially when you have these weird pattern piece shapes like this, where you've got such a weird angle here. It can be really, really hard to gauge. I am very nearly out of visual aids at this point, except for the interactive one. So we're going to just move on to that. These are my avatars wearing their clothes. I color coded them so you can tell the difference between the patterns. The women's is the green and the men's is the reddish color. And I guess we're just gonna start messing with the patterns so you can see how it gets weird when you do that. I probably should have just planned on doing this from the beginning. So if we want to try and start with the same sort of weirdness that I had going on earlier, if we take this high shoulder point and just move that up too high. I'm gonna think about it a second. Doesn't like running a video chat at the same time usually, but it will get there. So that's what hers is looking like. We'll do the same to his. And the pattern is mirrored, so it's modifying both pieces simultaneously when I do this. That's the way I do. That's what it looks like when you bump the shoulder up way more than I did before. So you can see it sitting up away from the body. It can kind of collapse down here. Same thing with hers, it'll collapse down onto the shoulder. And obviously that is not a look we really want to go for. So that's kind of what that looks like. If that's weird, I'm gonna undo that. There we go. So the other one that I did, so if instead of a high shoulder point being weird, it is instead the outer shoulder point. This one's a little bit harder to spot. If we bump that one up, same thing on his. The time being, I am going to take the sleeves off because they are really challenging to deal with when they're really difficult to deal with when they're in the way and they don't walk anymore because they just changed the arm size by a lot. But here's what those look like when your shoulder seam is too flat. You see, we've taken a lot of that angle out. So now we've got this big flappy bit sitting up off the body here. And it could shift to the front pretty easily, but it can also do the same thing, shifting to the back. And it really just is a matter, usually if my shoulder ends up a little bit too flat, I will usually use that as an opportunity to place it where I want on the top of the shoulder. So I usually try to aim for having my shoulder seam on my base patterns being right at that high point shoulder, where it's right at the corner of your neck and shoulder where they intersect, and then aim for this to be on that little knobby little bone right there. But again, it is up to you if you have a particular preference or time period where that is different. Now that we've undone that weirdness, the next thing that is a really common and weirdly tricky thing to deal with is if your entire arm's eye is sitting down too low. This one can be really, really tricky. And generally it's not going to be as far off as it's going to look like when I am doing this just super on the fly modification. But here we've got those drag lines I was talking about on the side of the torso. You can see those drag lines going down here. We see them on her as well. In the back, we also see them. They're sort of, hers kind of look like an X because it's sitting up on her butt. His drag lines are a little bit more vertical than hers are. There's so many things that are body dependent, guys. It's really, really tricky to learn this. But one thing you can see on his, even though his drag lines are a little bit more vertical, which makes it harder to pinpoint what's wrong, is you can see this little kind of fold on the back of his shoulder. So if we pick up right here, and the computer catches up with me, you see how some of those drag lines disappear. Same thing on hers. If we pick up right there, a lot of her drag lines disappear. And you can do the same thing in the front. A lot of the drag lines are going. A lot of the drag lines disappear. There's back to normal, or are we back too far? I have to close this and reopen this. I can. Shoulders still look funny. Okay. Other weird problems. So we did talk about this bust bubble thing going on. Unfortunately, I cannot make this any tighter across her bust without it just stretching out and being really just not practical. She needs to be squishier. One thing I didn't talk about last time, and I realized I should have done more talking to y'all about exactly how this pattern works. So all of my Cotehardie patterns that I've done are basically like this one, where they cut off pretty much right at the full hip. So it's right at the widest part of the body. And the reason for that is if you basically take, see if I can make the computer do it. If you take this line and you decide you want this, let's go with 15 inches longer, because he's going to get a nice knee-ish length Cotehardie. And we want that to be an extension. So we're just drawing a straight line right down the way it came. Obviously, we have to do that in front as well. Okay, remembered all of my stuff. So we do that to his, and he now has a knee-length Cotehardie that is not sewn together because it didn't update the seams when I did that. Cool. There's some tricky things with this program sometimes, but it is too far. But it is really fun to play with because you can do stuff like this where you were working on hypothetical garments and you don't have to use any fabric or even get up. There we go. But as you can see, he has a knee length-ish Cotehardie now that just has some sewing problems for reasons unknown. So really, all I did with that, even though I did it on the computer, which is a little strange, I just took that angle that we used for the last like 2 or 3 inches of the hip and just went straight down on all the pattern pieces. All it is just going straight down with that exact same angle we were using for the bottom of the garment. And obviously, if you want a fuller skirt, you can go further than that. Like, she would probably want a fuller skirt because most likely we'd be adding more length to hers. He only got 15. I don't know what she would. I'm having to guess. I'm guessing off the top of my head. Let's see. If my waist to floor is 42, she's about the same height I am. But we've got an extra 7-ish inches in there. We're gonna give her a nice even yard, and we'll see what that is. It takes a while to think about it, is what it does. So, all right, too much. Let's back that off just a little bit. Again, I apologize that I am a little bit lacking in visual aids. This is one of those classes that, depending very much on what problems we have, can vary wildly. So, okay. So now we've got her in a longer Cotehardie. him in a shorter Cotehardie. Obviously, I still need to update all of these seam lines if I want this to try and actually sew nicely, because the whole thing, the point I was making is that you can change how full your skirt is based upon how much fabric you have and how fancy you want it to look. It is entirely a matter of your preferences and what you want to do with it. That's probably what I did to mess up the other one. I just forget that the center lines don't quite, that is too far. Just forget that the center lines don't mirror, even if the pattern piece is mirrored, because they sew to each other. So that theoretically won't break anything. Except that it is. Why are you? Stop. What the heck? Stop. There are some challenges to working down in the living room, as I'm sure you've all noticed, because I end up talking to my computer a lot, because there are some just interesting challenges that I get to deal with at work. Okay. That's what I did. I did the same thing on her that I did on him earlier. We should be good to go now. Except that she just keeps going. Why are you like this? What the heck? Again, if anyone has questions, you can feel free to interrupt me, because I'm making this up as I go along. I really want her skirt to work, though, because I want to show you how easy it is to add extra length to the skirt. I don't know why she's not behaving.
So to make it wider, a much fuller skirt. I mean, I guess I've almost always used gussets when I'm doing that, up to about mid hip length.
Yeah, and that's a super easy way to do it. That's the way all of my Cotehardies are made as well. But apparently it is not as common in period once you get to a certain era. I have not exactly pinpointed exactly when the change is, but a lot of what I have seen has indicated that instead of doing your piecing that way, if you need to add in extra bulk, I've seen the piecing be more taking, like, I've seen a lot more of making your skirt wider by doing this, and then if necessary, having your splice be like that.
Slice, I'm sorry, I can't see what you're pointing. Okay.
Right here. A lot of what I've seen,
yeah.
Instead of doing a full triangular hip length gusset, I've seen a lot more more additions like that. Honestly, I think it depends on the fabric, which way I'm going to go on most things, because some fabric is fine doing that, and some fabric would just look better if it's more grain oriented.
So certainly up until 14th century, early 15th century Italian, which is what I know a little better, the pattern books, the original tailor's pattern books that we have show more of a gusset type, because it was more fabric efficient in some ways.
Yeah. And that definitely, I know that 16th century, they did the splice like I had shown there.
Right.
But I also, like, earlier tunics tend to be more, tend to be done more with the just pieced in full gusset that goes up to the hip. Okay. Not seeing
Thank
any reason that this shouldn't behave itself if I hit the button again. right? No reason you shouldn't behave. Can we behave this time? Ignore me when I hit the button, huh? I hit that button.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just toss in for people who maybe haven't made one yet, is that when you simply extend the angle all the way to the bottom, you have to be really careful not to stretch things so that they match unevenly.
More bias.
Yeah, there's a lot more bias to work with, and it can be real problematic in how the dress drapes.
Yeah. So yeah, that is a challenge. Is the bigger you make your skirt, the more bias you have, which is always a good thing to keep in mind. If we look at this, this doesn't look like a Cotehardie yet. Obviously, the skirt just doesn't look, it doesn't have that big, full medieval layer to it. This is the point where I would compare the skirt measurement to your minimum stride measurement and make sure that you are at least that big, but bigger does not hurt. I think we still have a pattern modification going on in here that somehow didn't undo itself well enough. But there's a couple different easy ways to do this. You could, as we talked about, put the straight line down here. You could instead do a triangular gore. Let's see if I remember which function that one is. You could just do a triangular piece that goes up and splices in, and do that at each of the seams. So you would have one that would go between the two fronts, one that would go between the two backs, and another that would go between the front and the back on each side. You could do that. You could widen the angle. There's a bunch of different options. One of the other things, though, that I will talk to y'all about is when you're doing your mock-up, since the mock-ups go just to this hip line here, I highly recommend when you get all of your pins and all of your Sharpie and all of your everything to figure out where your mock-up goes, draw yourself a line where your waist goes. Just like tie the string around your waist again and trace over it with a marker. Even out your hem so it's nice and parallel to the ground all the way around. And then measure from that line down to the floor, front, side, and back, so you know how much you need to add to make your skirt longer. Because again, I will vary how I'm constructing my skirt, but the thing that's important is you want to make sure you're hitting that target length. So usually what I do is I will straighten out this hip line, make sure that that's doing what I want it to do. And then I will measure down to above my knee, below my knee, calf length, and floor length. And even if you're only planning on making floor length dresses, it's still useful to know where your knees are so you can plan any embellishments. I'm a huge fan of heraldic garments. If you want to make sure that your heraldic whatever is well above knee length, so it's going to be more visible, or you want to put a band along the hem up to like calf length to make sure that you don't end up kicking mud up onto your skirt, it's good to know where those measurements are. So I highly recommend planning those out so you have them. The other thing that is also a really good idea is when you are wearing your mock-up, I always pattern it to be right close to the neck, right where you have to have a closure because you can't get it on over your head. But from there, the easiest point to figure out all of the various necklines you might possibly want to do is to draw on your mock-up all of those different necklines. I like to have a like nice and secure level where I feel like I could get it on over my head, but I'm not going to end up with sunburns I'm going to regret later. I like to have one that is like lowest I feel comfortable going neckline point. Square necklines are surprisingly difficult to do if you are well endowed because they are not square. They are never actually square on the pattern pieces. So the only way to get one that's going to look square on your body is to draw it on the fabric that when you're wearing the garment. That said, even if you don't plan on doing a square-necked cotehardie, one of the other handouts in my Google Drive is instructions on how to take a cotehardie pattern and pattern a German dress from it. So the Trossfrau dress that I have spent most of my SCA time over the last couple of years in is actually taken from my cotehardie pattern because I didn't have anyone to help me fitting it when I was making it initially. So I took a pattern I knew fit, and honestly, the fit of a cotehardie and a Trossfrau bodice, not that different. You just lop the pattern off at the waist, make it a square neckline, add some slashes and length to the sleeves, add yourself a cuff and gather on a skirt, and you're there. Like the rest of it's embellishment. Super easy to do. But I was shocked at how not square my neckline is on my pattern. It looks ridiculous on flat fabric, but it looks square when I'm wearing it, which is what matters. So yeah, I totally recommend drawing all of your drawing necklines, measuring out anywhere, measuring out at least reference points on your body. You don't have to do like everything, but I find that like just above the knee, just below the knee, and ankle length and floor length are at bare minimum for me that I write on my patterns. Oh, I do actually see a question in here about where to get this program. The program is called Clo 3D. You can download it. They do a 30-day free trial. It's pretty awesome. It's a really great tool for teaching yourself patterning because you can be over here and you can mess with the flat pattern and then hit this little button and see what you've done and then undo it. So you can tell if you're making things better or worse and what it looks like. Super, super useful tool for working on learning how to pattern stuff better. And it has a whole fabric library that you can pull from to render your render your garments in. And it comes with all of the avatars. They also, I swear they should be giving me a commission for this. They also, the avatars don't just stand there. They can move and do different stuff. So I can have him do a whole bunch of different things. I can have her do things. It would actually listen to it and clicking. It is not a huge fan of running in while we're on a video chat. But like I can have them do any of a bunch of preset comes with a pattern movements. Some of them are weirder than others because they don't like to sit on the floor. But in addition to all of the motions and things they do, you can actually program your own poses in there by moving around the rig underneath. You can also turn your garments transparent so you can see the ease over body. You can layer things. They also have these cool stress maps. So this is telling me that the skirt is too tight because she can't crouch in it. It's too tight across her knees. It's also not too tight across the butt, mostly just too tight across the knees. It'll probably decide it's too tight across the butt if I let it finish rendering. But yeah, these cool little maps that'll tell you and pay no attention to the falling triangles. But they bought that one and a different one that's very similar, but ever so slightly different that is mostly useful for stretch fabrics. And this one that tells you if it's too tight for the fabric to actually function like a garment anywhere. And this weird one that tells you where it's touching the body. But yeah, lots of cool things that it can do like that. If I have to do heavy lifting, how would I adjust the pattern? So we spent some time last time talking about sleeves. Sleeves make a huge difference in how something fits. I'm going to stop slowly falling triangles and put her back in a pose that makes more sense. So if you have to do some heavy lifting, have her stand back up, and I'm going to re-include our sleeve patterns here. Let's activate and show 3. Dang it. I deactivated them and then I moved them. So now their sleeves are not where their bodies are. Let's just undo that again, and we'll put their arms back where they were, and then we will go from there. There's some weird stuff to remember. But yes, so for heavy lifting, the biggest thing is you want to make sure that you have movement. I would honestly treat that pretty much the same way as I would fighting garb, which for my household is a fairly common thing, needing to make garments that we can fight in that are not going to be restrictive or tear if we're moving around a lot. As soon as he is done putting his arms down so I can turn the sleeves back on, we can start messing with sleeves. All right, activate, show. Now we're wearing the sleeves again. Sleeves are really cool because there's just so much that goes into them. You can do so many things to make very slight adjustments that actually do a whole heck of a lot. So I'm assuming that if you're doing more heavy lifting or setting up camp or fighting or whatever you need this mobility for, whatever that is, you want to make sure that mobility is the number one thing. You're not wanting this to act like court garb. I think it turned off all of my sewing. We're going to stop dividing attention, and I'm just going to pull up one of them. We're going to do one at a time now. That tends to make it run a little bit faster and be a little bit less weird and glitchy anyway. So here is our ladies pattern with the sleeve as is. So I have done what I can to try and make sure that she should have decent mobility. That's invisible right now. She should have decent mobility. If I want her to move around and say, put her arms forward, she should be able to do that without trouble. She can move her arms forward without much of a problem. But you do see here that there's some strain coming from the back. Interestingly, I have a thing that is going to show me exactly where it's too tight. Yes, so you can see exactly where this is too tight here. On a body, you'd be able to feel where it's too tight, but she can't actually tell us what she feels. The best we got is this color-coded map. So it doesn't matter which one we turn on, we can see she needs a little bit more room there if she's going to be able to do any moving. It's easy enough to think that we can add to this back part. That's not too bad. We poke right there, we can see exactly where it looks a little bit too shallow. So we can add a little bit of, we can take some of this here and move that just a little bit further out, give her just a little bit more room. Probably want to blend that in up to here as well. A lot of my patterns, because I hate having my arms restricted, I will bump out a little bit further than I would normally anyway, just because I want that little bit of extra space. But we can also do some of that in the back. So I talked I don't even say last week. It's been a very, very long couple of weeks for me, and I have no concept of time anymore. Yesterday we talked about what we can do with sleeves if we're doing any fighting. And again, we can see right there, that little dot is where it's looking too tight. So we can take this sleeve and we can make it look a little bit weird, but just bump some of this out a little bit. It's not too much. We don't want to add more than we need, because it's gonna look a little bit weird if we're adding too much. And everything that we add is going to be bulk we're going to have to deal with later. So that is another thing that we have to keep in mind. Is that anything we're adding to this is going to, when relaxed, be a little bit of extra bulk. So that's your reason for keeping it in moderation, because even if you don't care what it looks like, you're still going to have to feel it. So making those modifications, look at that. Almost all of the red stuff is gone. We made that fit pretty good. And having your arms straight forward, having just a little bit of red right there, that's not bad at all. And it doesn't look too weird. We just filled in a little bit. But when we have her put her arms back down, the issue we're going to run into is that she's going to end up with some bulk back there that just doesn't sit right. I've never put her arms all the way down, even though I didn't have her doing that before. So her arms all the way down. Let's give that a tug so it sits right. She has these folds. Let me turn this map off. I don't need it anymore. Why do you keep turning yourself invisible? Stop that. So we've got these folds here now. We've got this little bit of extra bulk right across the back shoulders. That's not terribly unsightly, but it is definitely something you wouldn't see in a, perfectly fitted court gown for someone who doesn't have to carry their own chair. Like, I wouldn't want to do that for, someone's step-up garb or anything. But there's not really a problem with having it for just like, this is my setup camp garb, or this is I wear it all the time when I'm marshalling or I'm fighting or, teaching very active involved classes or doing archery. Like, there's a bunch of reasons you could wear this and it doesn't look that bad. That would be the first thing I would do, is find where it's tight and give it a little bit of extra space. And usually on most people, at least if you're talking like forward arm motions, it's the bottom half of this back armscye, and it's this section of the back sleeve. Now, if you're doing lifting over your head, the other thing you're going to need to do if you want to do any lifting, and this is men's and women's, it doesn't matter, this is just the one that I opened up. The other thing you can do is, if she's lifting her arms straight out, she's going to get to a point right about there where she is straining the extent of her upward arm lift. And again, we talked about that a little bit yesterday, where depending on the angle of your sleeve cap, you hit an angle where your arm doesn't want to lift anymore without putting strain on the body. And again, we can turn on this map. It's not tight yet, but if she tried to lift her arms over the head, it would get there. And she's already definitely going to be lifting up any belt that she's wearing with this. The solve for that is, again, if you are definitely prioritizing mobility over aesthetic, the flatter you make this sleeve cap, the more mobility you are going to have lifting your arm, but the more bulk you're going to have in your armpit. So assuming we know we want to be able to lift our hands over our head repeatedly for whatever reason, I'm trying to think of an activity for which that is common, and I'm drawing a blank. But I would just raise this up a bunch and obviously smooth out your sleeve cap when you're done. And I apologize that I'm having to do all of this with like digital moving points instead of actually drawing on the pattern, but I've tried the actual drawing a pattern and it is far less visible over Zoom. So I am using the technology available to me to try and make sure that y'all can see what I'm doing without the light readjusting and white balancing and eating all of my lines. You can see them. That, I would make that sleeve cap as flat as I could. Again, we will also have to check. This has a handy tell you if your seams walk or not function. Anything that's highlighted in red doesn't get along anymore. Oh, but I'm only off by an inch. It's fine. Fine. You do want to check though to see if your seams walk. That won't go away now. But assuming your seams still walk when you do that, you're good. If your seams didn't walk close enough, you may also have to take just this outside point and move it out a little bit on both sides. You always want to move both sides. If you started with your sleeve balance, you don't want to just move one side, because this line and this line should be identical unless you're adding in seam articulation, which is awesome and really helpful if you're moving. But I mean, that is a whole different class, which I will happily get into if someone really wants to know about seam articulation. That said, there's an entire segment on on a class that I've taught previously, which is also recorded and available for people to watch somewhere. I will post the link when I find it to the Facebook page. But I did a whole segment on how to make fighting garb that fits better, with a whole section on seam articulation. Considering we are past 8 o'clock already, it would be a lot to try and get through tonight. I'm going with basic pattern changes for now. But if you do want to check out the seam articulation thing, I think seam articulation is super cool. And I have taught classes on it in the past. So I highly recommend you look into that. For some things, it's really, really beneficial. And you can trace it back all the way to the 14th century. We don't have a ton of extant garments that use it, but we do have some. Okay, so yeah, my suggestions would be fill in lower back arm side, bump the back sleeve a little bit higher than the front sleeve, and flatten out this curve a little bit, mostly by adding height to the underarm. If you think about it, adding height to the underarm is where that's where it's tight right here, is just giving it just a little bit more space right there. And obviously making sure your sleeves aren't so tight that you grow muscles too big to wear your garb, because that sucks. Not that I've done that twice on things that I spend a lot of time on. Yes, that would be my recommendation for lifting stuff. I would also make sure that your garment is long enough if you are dealing with a men's style Cotehardie that does just go to the hip length. I would make it maybe a smidge longer, because if you're doing a lot of movement, that's going to be lifting up a little bit more.
I came in a bit late, so I don't know what program it is you're using. Could you tell me what that is?
Yes, the program is called Clo 3D. They do offer a 30-day free trial. After that, you do have to purchase the program. However, as far as awesome software goes, it's not terribly inexpensive. It's not terribly expensive. It's
Okay.
It's fairly accessible, and there's a lot of video tutorials on how to use it. It does have a fairly steep learning curve, but if you find videos that show you how to do the thing, I have taught people a crash course in how to use this in hour and a half. And you really can, after the first day when everything is super awkward, just hit the ground running with it. It's great. I've been using it for all sorts of different things. I used it for my Halloween costume last year.
Oh, nice.
Now, does this program, when it comes to drafting a pattern for garb, would it be helpful for drafting pattern for any garb or just for simple stuff like the Cotehardie?
You can do anything with it. We sort of frightened the people training us how to do it at work when we got the program, because we sent them a pattern that has 54 pattern pieces in it. Most of them are cut too. We're like, can we make these super complicated combat pants? And they're like, yeah, eventually, but I'm not sure we're gonna have time in the week your training takes to teach you how. But no, you can do anything in it. Ridiculous example of what you can do in there. Do I have it still in here? My Halloween costume from last year was me trying to push it and see how far I could get. Like, what is the extent of bizarre I could get to work on this thing? I patterned a possum onesie with like the full-on existential terror scream hood.
Possum onesie.
Yep. I do all sorts of weird stuff, but I cannot find the file right now. I've done too much work apparently. But yeah, you can use it for just about anything. There are features in here for all sorts of different stuff. There's a whole section on there's a whole pleat toolbar that you can use if you're doing pleats. There's a gathering thing. Actually, I do know one thing that I have been working on. My first attempt at working on a SCA garment. Apparently, I have also moved to the archive somewhere. But I did a pattern for the bathhouse dress, which I drafted on paper for myself and then digitized it and then tried it on here to see how it would work. So I have done that one before. I also have a pattern that I'm working on for making a big fancy coat, because I have a pattern book that has a whole bunch of different patterns in it, which is great, but I don't know which one I want, and I really only have fabric enough to do one of them. So I decided that I was going to do digital renders of all of them to decide which one I like the best. And from there, I was going to figure out which one I wanted to do. So I have been working on a bunch of different things in this. Again, pardon the lack of real underclothes, not the priority. But I've been working on big fancy poofy coat. The reason this is orange is because there's a bunch of different settings you can use, and I have basically stiffened this piece as though it was pad stitched to an interlining, because it would be in the actual coat. But you can see the hanging sleeves and the poofs and the drapes. And
is that Italian?
German.
German.
But yeah, there's so many different things you can do with this. Like you really are not limited in any way. This program can do a ton of different things. It just takes learning how to do it, and some of it's super tricky. But
I'll tell you one thing. I see pictures, including period portraits, garments that I would really love to have, but to be able to get the pattern, I would have to draft it myself, and I have no idea how to do that.
So my recommendation would really be, this is a great tool for teaching yourself basic, like how patterns work, pattern changes. It's not going to teach you how to draft a pattern. You're going to have to figure that part on your own. There isn't, this is assuming that you have some skill where you can muddle through it just with trial and error, which is totally valid. But one of the things that isn't very practical and easy to do is things like anything that is going to be readjusting your anatomy. So it doesn't really get corsets because the avatar's body is not squishy in any way. It's challenging to do things that rely heavily on specifically placed boning, although you can stiffen an entire pattern piece with relative ease. It's pretty good at draping stuff, but it doesn't have smocking. Like there's limitations to it that you're not going to be able to completely construct the garment. That said, if you just are trying to get the basic pattern shape, it can be really, really useful because it can do things like, let's throw this back up on a simpler thing here.
I think that when it comes to wanting to learn pattern drafting, basic pattern placement and stuff like that is probably going to be like the very first thing you have to grasp before you do anything else in that department.
Yeah, but this does have things like, this has a function where you can draw on it. So you could start with a basic body block and draw where you want your seam lines to go. And then that line can be turned into an internal line that shows up in your pattern. So now you know where that line is. So using that, you could totally take this and, you know, make sure that that goes all the way up to the seam line there. And like there are things you can do to modify that. You can take that, turn that into a single line, and then you can say cut and sew that line. So now our pattern has this swoopy princess seam. You can do things like that. You can divide up pattern pieces and try to figure things out that way. And now we've got more extra lines that we can do. You know, maybe we want to take it in a little bit more at the waist or whatever. We can do that and then have that garment be a little bit more fitted right there. You can make modifications to it from this state using some of the tools in the 3D. Whether or not it's easier to learn digitally or on paper, it's very difficult to say. I learned on paper and learned this secondarily. I am seeing another question. Will I be providing hints to dealing with fitted supporter cotehardies? That is an excellent question. And yes, I totally meant to cover that. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to Women's Cotehardie for this just because she's the one who needs it. Fitted and supportive cotehardies. Basically, the thing with that is you need to get it fairly snug, but it only really needs to be snug right at the area under the bust to the waist. It really only needs this section here to be tight. And there's not a way to draft this from scratch. The best you can do is you end up with something like this as your mock-up, and the rest of the support fitting needs to happen from this state. I highly recommend, if you are going to be doing a bust supportive cotehardie, if at all possible, do your mock-up in vertically striped fabric. The reason for that is it's really easy when you're pinning in bulky fabric at the side seams and at the center front and at the center back. It's really easy to pin a little bit more on the left than you do on the right and suddenly throw your pattern off grain. So you end up with your left front being 4 inches wider than your right front, even if you're pretty close to the same size on both sides. If you have the vertically striped fabric and you keep your vertical stripes running straight up and down as you pin, you know you are doing your pinning in a balanced way that is not throwing things out of balance. So that would be my first recommendation. And I haven't seen anybody else talking about that in any of the instructions that I have seen. But that is my first tip: is mock-ups out of vertically striped fabric. It makes it so much easier. again, the focus on that, you really want to get just the underbust to waist area nice and snug, but you want to do it in stages. You want to kind of sneak up on it. You want to fit the front a little bit, and then the sides a little bit, and then the back a little bit. And then ideally what happens is you lay down on your back, adjust your anatomy to where you would like it to sit, and then repin up the center front while you're laying on your back. And then stand up and make sure that everything is staying more or less where you want it to be. I would also mention that I don't recommend doing sleeves on your mock-up if you are doing a fitted coat, a bust supportive Cotehardie. I would recommend doing it without sleeves and getting that bodice really well fit before you even attempt sleeves, because you're going to end up changing. You're going to end up changing not just the torso, but usually the angle of the shoulder seams needs to adjust after you do the bodice tightening part. It lifts in ways that just your shoulders change. So it would make your sleeves invalid. Yeah, printed stripes are not always perfectly on grain, but they're still helpful. Just anything to give you sort of a visual indication that you've taken a little too much fabric. Woven in stripes obviously are going to be a little bit more accurate, but unless you're out there with a level, generally any stripes you got are good enough to give you an eyeball read on it. I also always, there's some people who swear by never truing your right and left pattern to be identical. I am dyslexic enough that if I had a right pattern and a left pattern, even if I am slightly, I am slightly bigger on one side than I'm on the other side, if I make myself a right pattern and a left pattern, there's a 50-50 chance I'm going to be cutting those on the wrong side. I'd rather make them identical and just be a little bit off instead of a lot off. So I make all of my patterns symmetrical because I am close enough to symmetrical that it's not worth the effort to me. So when I true my patterns, after the fitting, I will take my left pattern and my right pattern, and I will take two different colored markers, and I will trace my left pattern on a piece of paper, or I will trace my new the left mock-up with all its modifications on a piece of paper, and then I will trace the right on the same piece of paper, sitting on the same, like centered on the same thing, and then take the Sharpie and just take the average between the two pattern pieces, and that's the pattern I use. I average them out when I put them together. Oh yeah, and stripes moving on the presser foot is really weird, but benefit of printed stripes, even if they're not accurate, they're on the inside, so you don't have to look at them while you're sewing. But yeah, that would be, that's what I usually do for my patterns. I know that there are some people are asymmetrical enough, it's really worth it to make a pattern that is slightly asymmetrical. I hope that all of those people are better at right and left and remembering to flip things correctly than I am, because I would fail at it so hard. I know so much of this has been like, I've got a handout for that. But in my Google Drive, the other handout, the one that is draping a fitted Cotehardie, that one has photographs and step-by-step instructions for how to fit a bust supportive version of this garment from a super cool poncho made out of striped fabric. But you can also just like skip the first half of it and use the instructions for the bust supportive part from this garment. Because with this, there are two different methods to get to the same result, but I have yet to find a way that you can actually draft your way into dealing with squishy bits. It's a challenge. So the end fitting stages are the same for both this and for the draped version. This one, you just are more likely to know that you have like nicely on grain patterns. Are there instructions on being aware of the grain in the fitted Cotehardie? Yes. I did all of my photo step-by-steps with a printed striped bed sheet on my gracious model who let me use her for my handout. And I talk a little bit about making sure that you are staying on grain in there while I'm recommending that you use striped fabric. So anytime I teach the draping a Cotehardie class, I usually bring just a bunch of plain striped fabric in order to help people do that. Oh, final fabric, things to be aware of, like stretch. So yeah, you are going to end up dealing with some bias when it comes to anything you're making that isn't rectangular construction. In general, I find that most everything until you get to about the hip level usually doesn't stretch too differently front to back. It's usually pretty reasonable. It's when you get to that long side seam on the skirt that things get challenging. I generally am a why would I use pins if I don't have to sewer. I will just sit down at the sewing machine and I will just go. There are the limitations to that is if I'm doing anything that is not perfectly on the straight of grain and it's more than like 8 inches long, I will at least put a pin in the middle of it to make sure it's not shifting. Fabrics you should avoid. Anything they made Cotehardies in history is good to use. Stretch knit fabrics are hard to deal with. I wouldn't recommend that necessarily, not that I haven't done that. I actually made it underdress to go with my really scratchy wool Cotehardie out of stretch knit fabric because I got it free from work and it was soft and fuzzy. So I actually do have a really fuzzy, warm, stretchy underdress that's made off my Cotehardie pattern. Yes, velvet is definitely challenging. I would consider anything that's challenging to fold and get it to stay straight is going to be challenging to sew, keeping it staying straight. So anything super slippery or anything super grippy is going to be challenging. Wool is a delight to work with, honestly. It's so well behaved compared to so many other fabrics. It doesn't fray a lot, it doesn't shift a lot, it doesn't stretch too much. If you end up with weird little bloops, sometimes you can just steam them and they go away. Wool is great. Love to do all of my sewing in wool. That would be my recommendation if you got the option. That said, you generally need an underdress to go with that because wool can be scratchy, especially the way it's made modernly. Yes, and linen is great if you are allergic to wool. Linen, you have to be careful to seal the seam edges because otherwise it will fray terribly. I'm a cheater and use a serger. Taffeta would be okay. That's another one you probably want to make sure that you're sealing the edges really well. Because yes, seam finishing is very, very important. Again, I'm a cheater and use a serger on things that are not going to be an arts and sciences entry because I have limited attention spans. But that's just me. Oh, cool. So on December 5th, there's going to be a class on seam finishing. Yay. So you can learn to do things the right way, which I highly recommend. It is good to know how to do things the right way, even if you usually do them the wrong way. There's 2 different ways to do everything. There's the right way and the fast way. Sometimes they're the same. Like, seriously, folks, don't avoid things like cartridge pleating because you think you can make your life easier doing knife pleats. You cannot. I'm not seeing.
Sorry, I do have one question. I'm pretty short-waisted and it's very difficult to make tops for myself just because of that. Would this program be able to be adjusted for that?
Yes. So here in this little avatar editor, you can do things like, okay, well, she is 65.5 inches tall, which happens to be exactly how tall I am, which is convenient, but you can change that. You can be like, all right, well, we want to make her 6'3". We just keep hitting this down arrow, or we just get impatient and turn her into 63. And once we've made her a little bit shorter, we can go through in all of these various sections here. There's not a perfect, like you can't adjust everything. I have been asking for ways to adjust like cup size for bustier people, so it's not just like all around bust circumference. But there's a waist height button right here. And there is high hip and low hip height. It sometimes takes some tinkering to get to exactly how to make the avatar as close as it can get to you, but you totally can do this as a customized avatar to an extent.
Okay.
The further you are from like average proportion, the weirder it gets. Like there's a particular thing, I think, if you guys want to see something super terrifying, where is it? If you shorten her sleeves, shorten her arms too much, she turns into a monster.
Well, she's already got a Hitler stash for some reason. Okay, there we go.
Yeah,
What?
but just like hide that. If you shorten her arms too much, she turns into a monster.
Yeah, she does look a little disproportionate.
Yeah, some terrifying things happen if you're too far from average. That said, the tips I was given with the avatar editor is, in general, if you start at the top and work your way down, it tends to work better. If you just like randomly, I was just in here messing with the arm length, and if you just mess with that arm length, it tends to get super weird because the arm length only adjusts a little bit with it as you're going. And anyway, it takes some trial and error, but there's always an undo button.
Okay, I'm probably gonna get nightmares from that.
Well, that's not the scariest one I've gotten. The other one had like her eyes got super big and she had like gorilla arms and was like,
Oh,
it was awful. Like, if you want to terrify people, seriously, just adjust the arm length. It gets awful. But yeah, so you can adjust the avatar to an extent. There is also a guide available for making your avatar like better avatar adjusting. And there's a couple different settings. There's basic, advanced human, and advanced dress form. Advanced human body tends to be the one you want to be on if you're going to be trying to make it into a you.
Okay.
But you always want to, they told us that you always want to do this top section, the total body, first before you mess with any of this other stuff.
Makes sense.
Because otherwise you get monsters. Yeah, it's a
genetic experiments gone wrong.
yeah, you get some real weird stuff going on in there. But yeah, there is some ability to adjust. Again, the here, back to normal-ish looking person. The most frustrating thing is it does not have an effectively dividable relationship between bust and underbust. So you can't, if you are super busty with a small rib cage like I happen to be, you kind of just have to go with, like, that said, my solve for this, which I have not done yet, is you can find very cheap or free downloadable 3D files, just object files you can import into this. And if you can find, like, I have not looked yet, so I don't know what I can find. Worst case scenario, a coconut bra that you can attach to the avatar, you can work around this. I know it's possible to do in theory, because for a while I was trying to get a helmet to work with one of the jackets I had to do at work because we needed a hood that went over a helmet. So I have downloaded object files and fought with them enough to get them to show up here and interact with clothes. So it is possible, theoretically, that you could find her some sort of bikini to add some bust size to her. haven't really played with that yet, but it is an option.
Okay. No, that makes sense.
But that is the biggest limitation I found, is that they assume that her bust is going proportional average to her size. But I have put in requests. I'm sure that there's people who work in swimwear who also are interested in this. It would be beneficial for them to listen to me.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. That's very helpful.
Yeah, no problem. I said I love this program, which is, compared to the program I use for the majority of my patterning at work, this one is so much easier to work with, and the tech support is so much better. Like I literally cannot say enough good things about it, even though there's a lot of limitations because their 2D patterning is not quite at the same level as the pattern I use for most of my work.
Is it terribly expensive after the trial?
I don't remember it being terribly expensive. Like, it is definitely not pocket change, but it's not like trying to get Illustrator or any of those other programs that tend to be not reasonable for a student.
I looked it up and it's $50 a month or $450 a year.
Yikes.
It's a professional program.
Yeah,
They're not cheap.
I mean, I could see that being totally worth it to get patterns that actually fit me.
yeah. So not pocket change, but it's not one of those, like, usually if you're looking at patterning software, you're looking at something like $1,000 a year at least.
Yeah.
So.
Do you know of anything more cost effective for those who are basically flat broke?
Yeah.
You're not
Well,
going to get the functionality that's going to help you, or much cheaper.
Well, and the other thing you can do is if you take classes on fitting your clothing anywhere you can locally, and sometimes you can find those, you can get a little bit closer. And then the second thing you can do is you can look for medieval or Renaissance, whatever period you're looking for, patterns that are really close to what you want. And some of those are very complex. I mean, like I have some that weighs, I don't know what, 1.5 pounds, and it's got 30 pages of instructions. But some of those are very, very good, and they can be modified to match. I know you were asking about pictures earlier, and they can be modified to look like those pictures, even by people who are not expert.
Yeah. And if you have something like that book that I mentioned in the beginning, the fitting and pattern alteration book, that will help you fit something to your body if you find something that's the right style, but just doesn't fit you. That book can help guide you through modifying things. Grand Essayette. I've actually made one at Grand Essayette before. Made 2 of them, and man, that is a mind-bending pattern to try and figure out.
That's why I thought it would be a good one to teach a class on.
It's on my list of things I would like to teach someday, but I need to play with it a little bit more because I've not quite gotten I've gotten it to work, but I've not quite gotten the sizing comfortable yet. So it keeps ending up smaller than it's supposed to be, and I have to figure out how I'm doing that wrong and how to how to modify the numbers to make that work. And then someone is saying first foray to 14th century from Viking age. Oh, good. I'm glad that it's making you feel more comfortable. Because my goal in everything is to try and make things more accessible. Because if you are stubborn enough not to let the fabric win, you can sew anything. It is all a matter of being stubborn.
That fabric's awfully headstrong.
I tell you,
Yes.
So do you have any classes on how to defeat tricky fabrics?
I do have a handout on the easy way to do applique, which is defeating fabric and something it doesn't like to do.
Delicate, gauzy fabrics that if you handle them wrong, they fall apart. Or smooth, slippery fabrics.
I would like
Try to get away from you.
to, our sister barony in British Columbia, Lionsgate, did a class on tips and tricks for sewing. And I encourage you to look that up. There are lots of great tips.
Thank you.
Including how to handle slippery fabric.
Yes. This has been so interactive. I mean, I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I am sorry I did not come a little bit better prepared. It has been a crazy week, but I'm glad that we were still able to discuss things that are, the second half of this class is always what is relevant to you, what is going to help you. And if that is a slightly off topic foray into other things, then that is what it needs to be.
Yeah, thank you so much.